Before introducing this panel, I would like to take you back to April 28, 2022, at the Thanatic Ethics Conference at La Maison Française in Oxford. Why I'm telling you this? Because I met all of them at the Thanatic Ethics Conference in Oxford in April 2022. And that's why I said I must chair. I didn't ask, I imposed. I said I'm chairing this panel. It is my honor to introduce the second panel of today, entitled Death's Questioning Borders. It includes 4 talks, and the first talk is by Olga Michael from the University of Cyprus, and her talk is titled The Refugee Boat as a Crisis Heterotopia. Olga Michael is an adjunct lecturer in Anglophone literature at the University of Cyprus. Her research interests include, but not limited to, post-colonial trauma, human rights, perpetrators' representations, and border crossings in a graphic life narrative. I strongly recommend you to read her 2023 book titled A Human Rights in a Graphic Life Narrative. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Olga. You can clap, yeah.
So with the so-called refugee crisis, the Mediterranean has become linked to deaths resulting from Europe's border policing practices, and with images of boats filled with people often over capacity. In this paper, I propose an interpretation of boat imagery in aquatic refugee border crossings through the lens of Michel Foucault's Heterotopia. I examine Massimo Sestini's award-winning photograph Rescue Operation, which was released in 2014, that shows refugees saved via the search and rescue operation Mare Nostrum near Lampedusa. I connect this analysis with both representations in Morten Durr and Lars Horneman's graphic novel Zenobia that accounts for the fictional sea journey of a Syrian girl, Amina, who fled her country with her uncle. I further draw parallels between the optic representations of the refugee boat in the above and those found in Safdar Ahmed's graphic narrative Still Alive, as well as with Turner's painting The Slave Ship, and with images of the Brooks slave ship from 1788. I propose that photographic depictions of refugee boats and people at sea highlight their function as heterotopias that foreground neo-colonial temporal and spatial links, showcasing the ongoing violation of racialized bodies on the move. These images demonstrate how racialized people experience specific aquatic locations as lethal, contrary to others that experience them as ones of leisure in the same temporal context. Such boat imagery also evokes the dehumanization of other people at sea across different temporal and spatial points, linking events and practices spanning from the Middle Passage to the contemporary policing of aquatic borders in Australia and Europe. According to Michel Foucault, heterotopias are counter sites that represent, contest, and invert other real sites. Crisis heterotopias can be forbidden places reserved for individuals who are in relation to society and to the human environment in which they live in a state of crisis. They are, in other words, other places for other people, which function at full capacity when men arrive at a sort of an absolute break with their traditional time. Time in heterotopias is experienced differently. In this paper, I propose to read the refugee boat at sea through the lens of Foucault's heterochrony and distorted time because of how it evokes the specter of colonialism and the slave trade, and the simultaneous experience of the same aquatic location as lethal on the one hand, and one of leisure on the other. Such an approach to images of refugee boats and the aquatic environments they navigate has the colonial potential, showing, as Michel Agier writes, how they can operate as means of epistemological decentering by exposing the wounds of what Walter Mignolo has described as a paradigm of modernity and coloniality. Okay. So my analysis starts with Massimo Sestini's award-winning photograph rescue operation. The photograph presents an aerial shot of a refugee boat in the waters between Libya and Lampedusa. On the website of the WordPress Photo, an NGO that champions the power of photojournalism and documentary photography to deepen our understanding of the world's complexities, promote dialogue, and inspire action, the photograph appears full screen. Once the viewer scrolls down, they are informed that it won the second prize of the corresponding photo contest in 2015. There is also a short paragraph describing the objectives and contributions of the Italian Operation Mare Nostrum and its replacement since 2014 by Triton, that was focused mostly on surveillance and deterrence as opposed to rescue. Next to this description, there is a picture of the photographer standing outside a flying helicopter as an omniscient observer. For Lila Lee Morrison, this photograph is evocative of the diagrammatic rendering of the Brooks slave ship from 1788. Since both images show two emerging forms of political exclusion due to economic interests, while the symmetry of the latter showcases order and the commodification of racialized bodies, the chaotic representation in the former indicates disorder and flattens the image's depth. In the boat as depicted in Sestini's photo, which utilizes a visual medium of contemporary military power, the aerial capture with surveillance and drone operations, refugees cannot be distinguishable, enumerated, and classified. In contrast to the African slave, she writes, the exclusion of the migrant as a political subject is defined by their position outside the agendas of global capital. As such, Sestini's photograph embeds in the present moment. It depicts the temporality of the transatlantic slave trade, which signals the emergence of Western modernity, thus shedding light on its dark side that remains hidden under narratives of progress, enlightenment, and humanism. It is precisely for this reason that I see the boat as a heterotopia that distorts the linear progression of time that is associated with modernity and progress. Lampedusa, Image Stories from the Edge of Europe, which was published in 2017 by the Migrant Image Research Group, showcases the impact of photographs in the structuring of Europe's refugee crisis via focus on Lampedusa. The collection includes photographs embedded in newspaper articles or posted online via social media, held by refugees, taken by photo reporters or other people, and introduced in short graphic narratives. The book succeeds in effectively showcasing how images are meant to mean differently in different contexts, their potential but also their limitations, as seen through its different parts and their corresponding titles, such as Photography is Good but Not Good Enough, A Question of Perspective, Bad News Makes for Good Photos, and a misleading caption, inter alia. Sestini's photograph appears in Estelle Blaschke's essay, The Boat is Full, as a double-page spread surrounded by a black frame. Like Lee Morrison, Blaschke explains that the overhead view produces an effect of estrangement, the third dimension dissolves, the objects portrayed are abstracted into forms and surfaces, making it barely possible to distinguish important details and information at mostly low resolutions and in print. Its size and high resolution in this case, however, as well as the textual context provided, allow the reader of Lampedusa to pay attention to the individuals on the boat and their reactions as they turn their gazes to Sestini's camera. To humanize them to an extent, and this reproduction raptures the flow of the essay, remediating at the same time the spectacular effect of the original photograph. In Blush's reading, as indicated by the title of her essay, The Boat is Full, the photograph is tied to a cultural memory different from the one described by Lee Morrison. It evokes the use of the same metaphor by Switzerland's Minister of Justice Edward von Steiger in 1942 in his attempt to legitimize sending back Jewish refugees and closing the country's borders. In the early 1990s, she continues, this slogan was back on the election campaign posters of one of Germany's political parties, the Republicans. Der Spiegel also put the point, the assault of the poor, refugees, immigrants, asylum seekers on its cover, with a drawing of a boat painted black, red, and gold that is in danger of sinking from the load it is carrying, similarly reversing the connotations of the boat that is full. The slogan, she writes, has subliminally entered the minds of many and resonates in all the pictures of overcrowded refugee boats as a particularly persistent association. Rescue operation is no Noah's Ark, she concludes. We are not all on the same boat, but instead we are looking down at it from a safe distance. As such, in contextualizing the photograph, she foregrounds the ways in which it links three distinct temporal points during which certain groups of people were discursively formed as threats against Switzerland, Germany, and Italy, while erasing refugee individuality and repeating human hierarchies that became sustained in the context of modernity and coloniality. At the same time, in allowing us to share the photographer's gaze, it reminds us of our privilege, as it also grants its creator a prize, legitimating his status as a photographer. The photograph thus operates as a means of epistemological decentering, exposing wounds that remain invisible or framed otherwise, as well as the limitations of a photograph in isolation when it comes to presenting the complexities of Europe's refugee crisis. Elsewhere, I read this photograph in relation to a similar depiction of a boat in Safdar Ahmed's Still Alive, discussing the potentialities of comics in terms of presenting Australia's refugee crisis in more nuanced ways than photographs. I discussed the insertion of insets showing close-ups to a refugee's embodied suffering in an image that depicts similarly distant aerial take on the boat, as well as the refugees' testimonial captions that verbally account for illness and other kinds of pain caused by deprivations and harsh weather conditions on the boat. As such, in its function as a heterotopia, the boat in Still Alive presents a decentered critique of Australia's border policing regime from within its aquatic margins. In addition, in its subtle allusion to Sestini's photograph, it evokes two spatially removed but ideologically connected bordering practices, as well as the human precarities they produced by rendering the oceans around each receiving country extremely hostile and frequently lethal. This link that becomes implied by the two images reconnects Europe, the old continent, with its penal colony, evoking the spectre of colonialism. This connection has also been identified in Joseph Pugliese analysis of Christmas Island and Lampedusa as sites marked by the harrowing presence of immigration prisons that simultaneously function as destinations for luxury holidays. Drawing from his analysis, I also look into the heterotopia structure in Zenobia, a graphic novel that accounts for a girl protagonist sea crossing from Syria to an unidentified location in Europe. The graphic novel also starts with a depiction of the refugee boat, full of people, over capacity, as the only object that ruptures the continuity of blue on the page. The next panel provides closer visual access to those on the boat and the protagonist, Amina. These panels are wordless, and Amina is shown scared among men who look rather terrifying in their visual depictions here in the second page, contrary to her image that reproduces a stereotypical representation of the innocent child refugee that is worthy of being saved. The reader's perspective becomes then distanced again. There is a storm, the boat capsizes, and Amina sinks into the depths of the sea. In the final page of this part, she is semi-visible underwater, and she says that no one can find me here. On the one hand, subtly suggesting her invisibility for those reading the graphic novel, and on the other, alluding to her hide-and-seek games with her mother, which are described later. Rather than being titled after the girl protagonist's name, the book is titled after Zenobia, the mythical queen of ancient Palmyra, whose story is told to Amina by her mother, as an example to follow, since the Palmyrean queen is presented as a symbol of female power and agency. After accounting for Amina's life prior to losing her parents and having to cross the Mediterranean with her uncle, the narrative returns to the scene of her drowning. The refugee boat is drawn among huge dark-colored waves. The refugees are thrown at sea, and an inset zooms in on Amina as she's also sinking underwater. In a double-page spread that follows, Amina's hair, as you can see, is in front of a shipwreck, and fish are drawn in black in a representation that points to the form of violence that her dead body is to undergo. The next two pages represent this perspective, but through a closer take on the shipwreck and the fish, so that Amina remains outside the frame of representation. In this case, the reader comes across the name of the sunk ship, Zenobia. In closely looking at it, it becomes possible to see how it has become an artificial reef for underwater life, while the heightened visual presence of the fish underscores the potential reconfiguration of Amina as a soulless part of the underwater food chain and life and death circles. The Zenobia is one of the most emblematic shipwrecks in the Mediterranean Sea. It is located 800 meters off the Larnaca harbor in Cyprus, and it has been described as an oasis for biodiversity that is nevertheless in danger due to climate change and human intervention. This biodiversity is indeed visually presented in Zenobia, whose title and the reference to the shipwreck fuse the story of the Palmyrean queen with that of the Swedish ship that sank at the shores of Larnaca in 1980. The shipwreck is also important for the scuba diving industry, as it annually attracts several thousands of divers from the entire world, with an estimated revenue of approximately 14 million per year. Recreational diving occurs without interruptions throughout the year and reaches a peak between June and October, with about 200 dives per day. In locating Amina next to it, among the life that it gives to underwater species, the graphic novel ambivalently highlights how a single aquatic location can be experienced simultaneously as leisurely on the one hand and violently lethal on the other. It thus indicates how racialized people whose lives are deemed unlivable and ungrievable, as per Judith Butler, become reduced to mere parts in the underwater food chain, while alluding to how those whose lives are not charged with the same precarity can enjoy the same space as one of expensive underwater leisure activities at the expense of environment itself and in favor of financial profit. In Lampedusa, too, the short graphic narrative on the way from Cairo to Rashid accounts for how smugglers buy fishing boats from people who have debts without official documents to carry refugees across the Mediterranean. Osama explains that fish boxes in the sea are where fishermen put fish and feed them for a short period. The fish grow fast, and the fishermen make a quick profit instead of following the traditional fishing process. Smugglers, he continued, do a similar thing. They put a lot of migrant people in places like the fridge inside of a boat, and they also make the most profit out of it. Fish and people have the same destiny, he continues. They are going to die. In other words, the overpopulated refugee boat enables maximum profit for smugglers through the commodification of refugees, whose life path is similar to that of fish. As such, while refugees are excluded from the West's capitalist expansion, as Lee Morrison argues in her analysis of Sestini's photograph, they become commodified and undergo perilous journeys that do lead to the financial profit, that of the smugglers. Further to the external depictions of refugee boats in Lampedusa, we are given visual access into an empty fishing boat, and a man explains that fishermen put fish and ice inside the fridge, but smugglers take people who want to migrate to Europe and put them inside this hidden place. The fridge has a capacity for 25 people. The smugglers put 200 people in the fridge and close the top over them. In the fishing cum refugee boat, in other words, people like fish are handled as mere commodities to be packed and shipped elsewhere, and human-non-human animal hierarchies collapse in how both species are reduced to lifeless cargo. Christina Sharp refers to the shipwreck of October 3, 2013, near Lampedusa, and the death of over 300 Africans who were described in the press as human cargo, explaining how it takes us back to the events surrounding the slave ship the Zong in 1781, when African slaves were thrown in the Atlantic Ocean for insurance money. Over 2 centuries after the crew of the slave ship the Zong threw overboard those living Africans, she writes, the word cargo repeats, and so do the horrors of the holding, the throwing, and the beating, which expose the afterlives of slavery and the afterlives of property. It is precisely through these neo-colonial afterlives that racialized bodies on the move become dehumanized and acquire disturbing position in human, non-human species hierarchies. In Lampedusa, Ghazal explains that in the past we were eating fish, now the fish eat us, something that's suggested in Zenobia and demonstrated in Turner's iconic painting, The Slave Ship, that shows a scene as described above, of the overthrowing of slaves from the Zong, with their bodies being eaten by fish. While none of the graphic narratives examined in this presentation explicitly show bodies being eaten at sea, it is strongly implied or verbally accounted for. As Pugliese notes, what is operative in the waters of the Mediterranean and on its shores is a zoopolitics that transmutes asylum seekers fleeing the harrowed lands of the global south into non-human animals. Referring to human body parts in fishermen's nets across Mediterranean coasts, he explains that categorized zoopolitically as non-human animals, refugees effectively possess, regardless of international protocols and conventions, no jural standing. They thus live and die outside the purview of the category of the human and the attendant rights and protections afforded by this legal category. Zoopolitics in the context of asylum seeker marine deaths, he continues, evidences the lethal effects of racial speciesism, which binds targeted human subjects to the possibility of being killed or being allowed to die with impunity, precisely as though they were non-human animals. If, as Agier argues, the heterotopia is a means of epistemological decentering, then images of refugee boats at sea, shipwrecks, and dead bodies in the ocean showcase the dark side of Europe's border policing practices, linking different temporal and geographical points to highlight the ways in which racialized people on the move become dehumanized and reduced to mere commodities. Thank you.
Our second talk in this panel is titled Nothing Different, on Narratives and the Multiplicity of Borders. It's by Lisa Senecal, who is about to defend her PhD dissertation at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lisbon. Lisa's research centers around the intersection of race, class, and migratory spaces. Please, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Yumna. Can you hear me well? Okay. So borders are structures that influence, control, and regulate mobility. Conrad and Sakar emphasize how borders are in motion. They focus on how borders move and shift. And it's true that borders are born from oppositional forces which sustain motion. They're dialectical. creating insides and outsides, which relate inside to outside, inside to itself, and the outsides also relate. They're compared with one another and contrasted. However, I'd like to propose that borders more than move and shift, with the concept of border multiplicity, which I'd like to say can be reasoned by the differential life and death experiences, that is, the differential consequences of borders. The question I want to approach in this presentation is, what do border deaths and border bodies reveal about borders? The refraction I want to emphasize here is that I'll look at borders from the perspective of border deaths rather than border deaths from the perspective of borders. In this way, the border becomes the object of study more than the individual border crosser, living or dead, who traverse those borders. I've conducted an ethnography of Malta's regime of borders, relying, though, upon the phenomenological borders. My conclusion is that when we empirically observe borders, what we find is not only a dialectic, but a polylectic, which parallels colonial categorizations and historic impediments to mobility. So what I aim to challenge here is the illusion that we've moved beyond colonial logics or the imperial gaze, and that contemporary borders reflect and are impossible to deracinate from those logics or that gaze. My hope, though, is that drawing these parallels might clarify the segregated and segregating nature of borders. I also hope to problematize the simplification of the legal-illegal dichotomy, which seems to be experiencing a reinvigoration in the problem space within which we're currently living. There we go. The image here is a memorial for those who lost their lives crossing the Mediterranean Sea, created by Maltese artist Sarah Maria Sculuna, entitled Remembrance, who says that while media and official reports focus on statistics of lost lives, this doesn't leave space for the mourning of the loved ones who lost family or friends. This work was created line by line in a repetitive manner, and it represents the sea's surface and the rising number of losses. To be sure, this is an alternative narrative in Malta, which aims to push back on more dominant ones. But I'm going to turn now to those. So in October 2013, the same month that Prime Minister Joseph Muscat, the newly elected Labour Party leader, introduced the so-called Golden Passport program in Malta, a boat capsized attempting to cross the Mediterranean. It was about 120 kilometers off the coast of Lampedusa. 34 people died, and 3 of them were small children. Muscat claimed he felt abandoned by the EU, and that Malta and Italy had saved lives by deploying SAR vessels. And he claimed that the rest of Europe just provided empty talk. He said, "I don't know how many more people need to die at sea before something gets done. Rules need to change. Whether they're tighter or looser is not the issue. The fact is that the thing is broken and needs to be fixed. As things stand, we're building a cemetery within our Mediterranean." Here we see numbers as significant, counting registers. This is the phenomenon that Horsti calls enumeration. She claims that enumeration is the most dominant way that people understand border deaths. On 18 April 2015, 24 of the likely more than 800 decedents from that infamous shipwreck off the coast of Lampedusa were buried in Malta some days later. A contact I made at the Burial Administration Unit at the cemetery, Audalorat Cemetery in Malta, told me that there had been several bodies buried in the cemetery years ago, but that there were currently none now, and that there had not been border deaths for some time. This contact recalled 35 or 40 bodies buried in the cemetery 5 years ago. This narrative was not quite right. Here is a data set that was shared with me called the Immigrant Death Register. So you can see she's almost right. She's almost remembering it correctly, but not quite. Oop, I want to go back. Sorry, can I go back too? Thank you. UB153, UB155, UB156, or UB157. After locating them in the cemetery, these are the bodies that I located in the cemetery in Malta. A contact told me, I emailed, sorry, I'm getting myself confused here. So I emailed to see if I could get the death certificates for these bodies that I had located in the cemetery. And they asked me to come in at the Identity Malta, the place where they would issue the death certificates. I think he just wanted to tell me in person that I wasn't going to get the death certificates, but then he wanted to have a conversation. And he was holding the papers, the death certificates, in his hands. And what he said to me was, "There hasn't been a death like these for years, thank God." And again, he reiterated later in the conversation, there had, thank God, been no recent border deaths. The problem, of course, is that there were border deaths in every year except for 2010, and bodies recovered. Of course, many more deaths. The executive medical laboratory scientist recalled the outpouring of flowers from the Maltese people following the burial of 24 decedents from the 2015 shipwreck. They were brought to Malta to be buried. And he showed me a photograph of an entire room in the hospital filled with flowers. We were full of flowers. At one go, we couldn't cope, to be honest. We had to ask people to stop sending them. I'll show you because actually it's beyond explanation. So he showed me this photograph, and you'll find that it does not have any logic, but especially when there are children around. Nobody cares about the skin color, for sure. So I found the last comment much more curious than the flowers in the room. But he proceeded to explain that when bodies are identified, the unidentified number assigned to them stays with them. They continue to be identified by the numerical marker. In his explanation, I understood he was describing an overlap between the death and migration management systems in Malta. He told me, so what we do is we keep them in a body bag and give them a number. That number we use, and even when they're identified, they still bear that number. Because logistically for us, we wouldn't know that that person was actually identified, but they don't lose that number. When I spoke with a representative from the Armed Forces of Malta, I asked if there was something distinct about the approach that might be taken vis-a-vis extra-legal border crossers and some other scenario where a boat in Malta's SAR zone or territorial waters might be in danger. He assured me that the approach to rescue, there is nothing different because they're migrants. He reminded me Malta was only required to coordinate within the SAR zone. There was no duty to act. This implies Malta doesn't have legal jurisdiction in that zone, as it's considered the high seas. He characterized this as, quote, no man's land. He was crafting a narrative of ambiguity vis-a-vis legal capacity, a disconnect where inaction or the possibility of absolution of blame could be strategically employed. There was another distinction that this representative and most other professionals and administrators wanted to make before we began any interview. And this was the distinction between regular and irregular migration, or legal and illegal if they'd been working in the migration management system for many years. Normally they would correct themselves after saying this. These narratives reveal the significance of numbering, enumeration, and group deaths. The collective but not the individual is recognized. And I read this as a kind of objectification, which is ultimately a dehumanization. But I also read these narratives as revealing of the duplicitousness or the multiplicitousness, to stay with the term, consequence of what Agnew called border thinking, or what I've called the cognitive and emotional elements of borders. It's as if the discursive effect of border talk is to render the border as a singular or consistent, as if there were one border, always the same. Yet this singularity is itself a discursive production, a technique through which multiplicity, contradiction, inconsistency, and historical contingency are flattened into a coherent image, the icon of the border. This allows for confusion that we're all subject to the same border. We're not. That's a convenient legal fiction. And now I'll show you empirically why I think this is the case. The ethnography of the border I conducted was over the course of 3 summers in Malta. I considered 10 living border crossers and 4 would-be border crossers who died and were buried in Malta's cemetery as informants in this study. I explored the differences and commonalities in how the physical, institutional, cognitive, and emotional borders presented to or impacted each border crosser. Yeah, perfect. So in this presentation, I'll present 2 moving counter maps. The first represents the physical journeys of UB153, whose body was recovered on 27 July 2020 in the Mediterranean Sea and was buried on 14 April 2022 in level 1, the deepest level of grave 159 in Adelarat Cemetery. The bodies of UB155, UB156, and UB157 were all recovered on 16 July 2021, and all were buried on 16 April 2022. UB157 rests at level 2, UB156 rests at level 3, and UB155 rests at the top, level 4. The location of recovery was noted as C for UB155 and UB157, and this was missing on the death certificate for UB156. It was confirmed that these bodies were recovered in proximity, and all of these bodies were confirmed to be individuals originating in sub-Saharan Africa, per the medical examiner. This is all I know about them. This counter map aims to illustrate how the borders of Malta impacted those would-be border crossers reaching into their countries of origin and into Malta's SAR zone. They felt, sensed, and experienced Malta's borders in each of these locations. Even if the precise locations are unknown, their journeys were directed by Malta's borders. The next moving counter map collates all of the experiences of border crossers, informants, yeah, but it will move. So this is all of the experiential borders of Malta based on the crossing experiences of all 14 border crossers. And when we view borders holistically in their totality, it's clear that Malta's borders are not just Schengen's borders. Furthermore, the border as a singularity is a discursive fiction. Thank you. Malta's borders are multiplicitous. People move across borders and borders move across people. They present differently to different border crossers. Sometimes they're in places they seem they shouldn't be, and other times they're in places where they're not supposed to be. James Clifford relied on the roots, R-O-O-T-S, R-O-U-T-E-S, pun, to emphasize how the routes available depend on your roots. So primarily, the path that presents as available is linked with the country of origin of the border crosser, and secondarily, 2 markers emerged in research as significant mitigating or intensifying factors, privileging inequality or creating greater inequality, and these were class and race. And I consider these polyvariant in context. As I'm saying this, you might suspect that I'm emphasizing the difference in how the physical borders were experienced, and I am, but that's not the entire story. I found that the physical and institutional borders, which is to say the border crossing points or the territorial borders and the regime of visas, I found these to be much more fluid and adaptable to individual border crossers, while the cognitive and emotional borders much more fixed. Thank you. This next map represents what Van Houten called the white and black Schengen list. I made this map on mapchart.net. It's a great site if you're looking to make a map, check it out. This map depicts in white the countries from which an individual border crosser may enter Schengen without a visa. And it depicts in black the countries which require that an individual border crosser must possess a visa to enter Schengen. This is the final map, okay? And I put a QR code because it's quite hard to see. So please look at this map. This map was created in 1821. Its full title is called The Moral and Political Chart of the Inhabited World, exhibiting the prevailing religion, form of government, degree of civilization, and population of each country. I want to call your attention to the key. It's in red there. The shading on this map reflects the areas and peoples of the world categorized as savage, barbarous, half-civilized, civilized, and enlightened. Like all maps, this map divides space physically and cognitively. It reflects and produces geographic and cultural knowledge, of course reflecting the imperial gaze. Many people think, okay, this is an old map, let's talk about the present. We maintain different conceptions of world space and people now. But there's a flaw in this logic. The experience of borders dramatically changes according to the category border crossers are slotted into. New categories have reconfigured the old ones, but when we compare this map with the previous one, the majority of people living in countries that were shaded as savage, barbarous, or half-civilized in 1821 still cannot legally travel to the areas that were shaded as civilized or enlightened. Current borders are linked with historical ones and to the ideological gaze of colonialism. This influences our current thinking about borders, and more importantly, it influences many people's thinking about border crossers. I want to say that this narrative that there is nothing different is dangerous. It undermines the reality that there is something very different. That something, though, is how people are categorized by virtue of their countries of origin, due to the randomness of where or to whom one is born. There is, however, a nugget of veracity contained within that narrative of nothing different, and this speaks to the ideals of individuality and liberalism, and the ideals of human rights, which we can also deconstruct some other time. For now, I implore you, though, we need to stop speaking about the border as if there's one, as if it's singular, integrated, and equal. It's not. Admitting this, I think, is the first step. Imagining what could be is the next. But the multiplicity of borders is an intervention that speaks to the segregated and segregating function of this inherently unequal device. Thank you. Sorry for my Ludditeness.
Our third talk is titled Visualizing Death, Resistance and Survival in the Tunisian-Libyan Borderlands. It's by Dr. Ahlam Shimlali, who defended her thesis 2 months ago. She is now a postdoctoral fellow at Aalborg University in Denmark. Her research explores the politics of life and death in transit, focusing on the local and gendered effects of European border externalization in North Africa, particularly the Tunisian-Libyan borderlands. Please, Ahlam.
Great. So thank you. Yes, I will, as Yumna just said, my research focuses on life and death in transit, or the politics of it, and I've focused on, you could say, the consequences of European externalization policies, specifically in North Africa and specifically in Tunisia. And I trace what I call the ripple effects of externalization, which were the rings in the water is what I will focus on. It's a paper I published, focusing especially on Zarzis in Tunisia. And kind of what I want to argue with that is that these ripple effects of externalization, like rings in the water, impact not just the people, usually migrants, but also it has obviously gendered racial effects. But what I focus on is that it also has environmental, spatial, temporal, and existential consequences. And this presentation will focus on Zarzis. I've conducted fieldwork across Tunisia, in Tunis, in Sfax, Kerkene Islands, Zarzis, Medellin, Tetouin, and also in Tripoli in Libya. So Zarzis is a coastal fishing village near the Libyan border, and it has also become synonymous with death. And I spend a lot of time here in Zarzis with the fishermen, which are not usually you could say the objects of EU border externalization, but in many ways have become very much entangled with it. And so I spend a lot of time at the port and with the fishermen here. This is Slaheddin Shadak and Borasin, who are heads of the Fishermen Association and the Fishermen Union. And many of them voiced their frustrations with me. Pollution, shrinking fishing zones, a lack of state support, harraga. But there was also one topic that kept getting brought up, and that was the mafia. And they were referring to the Libyan Coast Guards as the mafia. And they spoke about, repeated attacks and kidnappings at sea, violent encounters, and extortions that had become routine. And this is also, you could say, something that I frame as a ripple effect of EU border externalization. And I will, in this presentation, focus on three ripple effects. So the first one, as I didn't mention the quote here, that Slaheddin Shadak says, look, the problem is political and started when the European Union started making agreements with Italy, Malta, and Libya, dividing and making new borders in the sea. This is the problem. And as we just saw in Lisa's presentation, the map of the SAR zones, I have one here as well. And what they were referring to is especially when I would talk to them was the pre-borders, where they would refer to how they could fish in pre-SAR zones close to the Greek, close to the Maltese coasts with their grandfathers and fathers, and that this is now an impossibility. And they would also, of course, talk about this as having been disrupting their livelihoods, but also becoming a risk for them to go out at sea because they can encounter these Libyan Coast Guards, EU-funded, and sometimes even militias. It's a very, I could say, gray zone when it comes to the Coast Guards. And I think one of the first, you could say, ripple. I have a new tablet that I'm learning to use, but I can tell the story of Amin. Almost everyone had a story from the fishermen, and like Amin, he was a seasoned fisherman who was kidnapped in Tunisian waters while on his boat. He was smoking a cigarette and pulling in the net. And then the Libyan Coast Guard speeded up, and with a gun to his forehead, he was kidnapped. They didn't even ask for my name, he tells me. They forcefully pushed him into their bar. I have a new tablet that I'm learning to use. But I can tell the story of Amin. Almost everyone had a story from the fishermen. And like Amin, he was a seasoned fisherman who was kidnapped in Tunisian waters while on his boat. He was smoking a cigarette and pulling in the net. And then the Libyan Coast Guard speeded up, and with a gun to his forehead, he was kidnapped. They didn't even ask for my name, he tells me. They forcefully pushed him into their boat and sailed to Zawiya, west of Tripoli. Once they arrived, he was given an old Nokia phone and told to contact his family to pay a ransom of 14,000 Tunisian dinars, which is approximately 4,000 euros. And luckily for Amin, his family was able to quickly collect money from savings, close friends and relatives to pay for his release. And he was back in Zarzis less than 72 hours later. He says himself that he was lucky. He only suffered minor bruises and injuries, but the violent kidnapping and traumatic experience has taken its toll and has severely also impacted his family's livelihood. And as he says, I fear going out to the sea now. Imagine that, something I've done since I was a kid. So this is kind of how I structure the first ripple effect as this violence and trauma at sea. The second ripple effect is ecological. I met Samir Khnizi here in the picture. He's a sponge fisherman and an expert diver who for 37 years was the go-to man for getting the national treasure, which is the sphinge or the sea sponge, sphinge in Tunisian. But as he says, or many of the fishermen tell me, all the movements with the motorboats and the rebordering, maritime reboarding, has impacted the small fish and all the algae systems underwater. And these disruption has also pushed away all the small fish that they usually is closer to their Tunisian territorial waters, and also made the traditional fishing grounds inaccessible, because usually then they have to go further away, but that's have become very risky, and if they are being caught in Libyan, you could say in SAR zones that are Libyan, it's basically Libyan territory, and they can get kidnapped. So these disruptions have also obviously impacted their fishermen's livelihoods, and many of them, especially the younger fishermen, have started to work with harraga, facilitating journeys, smuggling to survive. And in many ways, this has impacted the cultural heritage that has been passed down through generation, and that is slowly disappearing. These are some pictures Samir wanted you to see. So I understand this as an example of slow violence. So in recent years, Rob Nixon's theory of slow violence has become increasingly influential in geographic discussions of violence. And here I argue that fishermen are caught between the fast violence from the Libyan coast guards and the slow violence of ecological collapse, and that both of these violences are connected to externalization through the ripple effects. So the third ripple effect is death. And due to a particular wind called Al-Qibli that comes from the Sahara and up to Libya, and then goes to the west, bodies of migrants who drown off the coast of Libya drift towards Zarzis and the bay there in Qabes. And the fishermen then regularly have become accidental frontline workers. So they are the ones who pull in the fishing nets and finding bodies. They are the ones who are finding these shipwrecks at sea. So death has in many ways also become routine for them. And so routine that actually at the Fishermen College, they now in their curriculum have a segment just focusing on how to deal with dead bodies and decomposed bodies. And in Zarzis now, as a consequence, there are also 2 cemeteries. I've marked them in red. So there's Cimetière des Inconnus, which is the smaller one in the bottom, and Jardin d'Afrique. And they are very different cemeteries, but you can see this is just a Google satellite screenshot, but they are close to the coast, and also the city is up north, out of the frame here. The first one, Cimetière des Inconnus, is on a former landfield, and bodies have been buried there manually, but also sometimes with an excavator, and bodies have been basically poured down into a big hole, so basically a mass grave. And you can walk around this area and find human remains that are still visible due to the porous ground, and if it rains or stray dogs running the area, you can find bones sticking out of the ground. As a, you could say, consequence and a result of this, Jardin d'Afrique came into play, which is created by an Algerian artist called Rachid Qureshi, who wanted to dignify the deaths, and so migrants who washed ashore could have a dignified resting place. And both have, this was fieldwork during 21 and 22, were already at full capacity with over 1,000 bodies buried in each, and many of them, especially in the Cimetière des Inconnus, buried on top of each other. So I arrived shortly after this was inaugurated in 2021, and there was a lot of buzz around it, and UNESCO was there, and many people were invited. Many were also not. For instance, the ones Shamsuddin Marzouk, who was working with the Cimetière des Inconnus. So there were already starting to be a rift between these two cemeteries and the people associated with them. But what they wanted to do was, for instance, to have a DNA profile and try as much as possible to have some identification in Jardin d'Afrique, which was not possible with the other cemetery that did not have any gravestones. And they also, next to Jardin d'Afrique, or inside the cemetery, built in a morgue for the bodies that were arriving but never really got into functioning, because the situation, this was how it looked in 22 and 23. And this is how it looks today. It's closed down and not functioning, as well as the other. And this is also, you could say, one of the problems with working on this, and especially in the context of Zarzis, where you have different actors, and how these politics of death, and then people who are governing the death also results in power dynamics between the different actors. And what I try to, well, at least in my research, how I understand this is by conceptualizing this through felt externalization as an attempt to capture the intimate, the lived and the embodied experiences of these policies. And this is also, a way to go beyond the policies, the visible and the spectacular, and instead capture the everyday, the slow, the granular and felt experiences of border externalization, be it the fear or trauma that Amin was experiencing, or the environmental degradation, or of course the collective trauma that many people experience in these cities, when their cities also become death zones. And so a third actor is also a local in Zarzis, Mohsin Lihidhib, who works with these art installations where he basically collects and have been collecting everything that comes up on the ground on the shores to make these kinds of installations. Yeah, it's my cheeks. So I would say the death at sea and this slow but steady flow of bodies that wash up on the shores are not the highly visible or spectacular killings, but rather a slower, stealthier, and less obvious form of cruelty. And in many ways, the spectacular have descended into the everyday. Border deaths in the extended borderlands of Tunisia render migrants disposable and ungrievable. But people, like the different actors, the fishermen, instead insist on visibilizing this tragedy and bringing dignity to also what Shamsuddin al-Quraisi referred to as le damné de la mer, so invoking le damné de la terre by Fanon. Or, for instance, Mohsin Lihidhib, who makes this art installation in his small museum called the Sea Memory Museum. So Zarzis is also a marginalized city in Tunisia, a fishing village, and it lacks the resources and space to deal with the dead. And right now, we don't know what the situation is. For many times, or for many years, it has also been Sfax that has been kind of the main hub there, and the morgue, which has also often been also at full capacity. And so in the absence of state responsibility, it is locals, it is the fishermen, the artists that step in to fill this gap, and they are the ones that rescue in this absence, they grieve in this absence, and act in this absence. And by filling the voids of care and responsibility, by politicizing intentionally and unintentionally the bodies and the remains of the dead, challenge the boundaries of grievability, and also issue an appeal to visibilize what has been made invisible. So, thank you.
The last talk in this panel is titled The Forgotten Frontier, Death on the Mediterranean Eastern Pyrenees Border by Sid Bolton and Catriona Jarvis. Sid Bolton is a non-practicing human rights lawyer, and Catriona Jarvis is a retired judge from the UK. Both of them are from the UK, and both of them, Sid and Catriona, they created what is called the Last Rights Project, which is part of the UK charity Mitoria. This Last Rights program is creating a new framework of respect for the rights of missing and dead refugees and migrants and bereaved family members to transform research and legal principles into deliverable, real benefits and respect for human rights. Sid Bolton, the floor is yours.
As Jumna said, I'm a lawyer. By non-practicing, that really means I don't have an office in the UK as a solicitor, but with Catriona we do a lot of legal work on behalf of bereaved families, and advocacy in terms of human rights and refugee rights. So, not disappeared.
Microphone.
Not disappeared from the law, but today I don't intend to talk about the law. And that's okay. I'm speaking. No. Okay. Right. How's that? But today I really want to talk a little bit about our work, which is more in terms of memorialization. We have done some work in different countries on thinking about how we memorialize something as difficult as refugee deaths, particularly faced with a lot of destruction of physical memorials by far-right groups and persistent attacks on communities. But today, and Séverine spoke very forcefully about her own family history in the Hautes-Pyrénées, I want to talk of the increasingly dangerous and yet quite misunderstood, undocumented route across the Pyrénées Orientale between Spain and France, which is essentially the mountain part between Barcelona and Perpignan as it comes up the coast. And that is one of the least documented and understood contemporary border corridors, but its historical importance and significance helps us understand the phenomenon of mass flight from persecution and its fatal consequences, and it helps us, I think, cast an important light on present-day European border security policies and our own responses to those. In that, I'm indebted to Professor Aix-en-Provence of the University of the Basque Country for his major 2023 study, Legal Architecture, Return Procedures and Fundamental Rights in the Eastern Pyrenees Border, for much of the knowledge that I rely on, both historical and contemporary. But the rest of it is because we now live right on the border, about 15 minutes from the actual border, on the Pyrénées Orientale route. And so to speak really about my kind of daily lived experience of walking in those mountains, on those tracks, and some of the things that are really more personal observation than research. But as Ika said to me, the Pyrenees border is the great unknown in the academic world. So this short presentation is itself in the form of a journey and a photographic journal, starting with the Retirada to France from Franco's fascist Spain in 1939, Walter Benjamin's flight from Marseille and his death at the Spanish border in Portbou in 1940, through to the contemporary migrations from Africa to Europe using the same routes today. Along the way, public and private acts of preservation and memorialisation have continued to mark these significant places, events and deaths. And these include graves, waymarkers, repositories of collective memory, cultural collaborations on both sides of the border, literary, linguistic, artistic, musical and educational interventions that provide an enduring record of exile and loss, as well as a tool with which to examine and respond to and influence the current contested political space at our borders. I think it was French philosopher Guy Debord who defined psychogeography as the study of the specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organised or not, on the emotions and behaviours of individuals. That particular theme of literary writing has been well worn since Debord, but in terms of borders, memory, history, and contemporary connections and practices, the path taken on this route may be said to be freighted with traces of past emotions, behaviours, and the accretion within geographical space of a collective, continuously refreshed and accumulated memory, politics, and physical repetition. The contemporary Trans-Pyrenees route is such a phenomenon, with today's migrants walking the same well-worn tracks as their predecessors, including Walter Benjamin and those who had to flee during the Retirada. Waymarkers acknowledge those journeys, they punctuate the routes of contemporary refugees, and they provide positive reinforcements of the image of the refugee and the endurance of the harsh journeys and conditions that they experience. In the language of information boards, in the memorials to key actors and events in the camps transformed into today's museums. The account of the German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin's final and fateful journey across the Pyrenees in September 1940 is well documented, and his footsteps are well signposted and well trodden between the coastal village of Banyoles and the Spanish frontier town of Port-Boo in September 1940, following 7 years in exile in France and 28 changes of address. That last journey commenced in Marseille. Where Benjamin had been issued with a provisional passport by the US Foreign Service, from where he intended to travel to Spain and then to Portugal to catch a ship to the USA. He was stopped at the border by the fascist dictator Franco's border guards, and between the evening and the morning at the Hotel Francia in Port-Boo, rather than being returned into the hands of the Gestapo he took his own life. Hannah Arendt subsequently came to look for his body, which she eventually located in the local cemetery. In due course, his remains were moved to an unmarked grave behind the cemetery, along with others who had disappeared. I think here you can see on the right is the Fosse commune, and inside the cemetery itself is, in Catalan, a tribute to all those who were forcibly disappeared and went missing during the Retirada. On the same border crossing, along the same path through the same villages, but in the opposite direction, only 12 months previously, in the bitterly cold winter of 1939, around 100,000 refugees, including defeated Republican militia, started to arrive in France. It was bitterly cold. The first photograph I showed you of the Pyrenees those were essentially the conditions in that February 1939. The refugees, having fled, risked appalling treatment in France and found themselves detained in atrocious and for many hundreds fatal conditions, corralled initially without any form of shelter onto the beaches of La Miranda at Argelès-sur-Mer and along the coast at Saint-Cyprien, Barcarès and Rivesaltes. The term concentration camp was used by the French authorities themselves for this form of incarceration of refugees. A memorial to the 70 children who died on the beach in Argelès has recently been erected. Yeah, that's it. Perhaps unique in its historical moment, this particular refugee route operated in both directions more or less simultaneously, with each side fleeing from the emerging fascism of Europe. Benjamin's death and the retirada, the retreat of the exodus from France as Spain is commonly known, commemorated perhaps more than many other refugee routes, a memorialisation of refugee flight that's grown and become more embedded into that landscape and the culture of that region, in both Catalonia Sud and Catalonia Nord, Catalonia spanning both sides of the border. Since the death of Franco in 1975, and the more recent process of unpicking the nationally determined official amnesia of forgetting, which was agreed by all Spanish institutions, save for the families of the many victims themselves. Several memorial camp museums now exist along the route and host contemporary art, music, literature and political events linking historical and contemporary migrations and exiles. Photographic trails and walking signs all preserve the continuity of memory, not just as the past, but the continuous present and refreshing of that narrative. On the same routes today, I've regularly picked up discarded immigration papers lying in the garage and observed the same detritus of migration routes that we see elsewhere. In Portbou, on the Spanish side, in 1994, the artist Dani Caravan installed a very moving piece of public art called Passages. It's dramatically situated on the cliffs just by the cemetery where Benjamin was buried and recognises both these migratory pathways. As I say, it's a moving piece of work and very contemplative. It powerfully evokes for me the enslavement gates of no return in West Africa's slavery forts and the unknown and uncertain future ahead. On the French side of the Pyrenees, the direct lineage of a distinctly left-leaning local community has over many generations of exile become well embedded into local political and cultural life, assisted without doubt by the pre-existing trans-frontier Catalan identity of the region. This, despite the persistent drift to the right on this part of the Mediterranean politically, is maintained and is quite strong, really because of the close historical ties to the retirada and its decades-long narrative, which makes the local attitude, for now at least, more welcoming to refugees and migrants. Indeed, Catalonia on the south side has a distinctively differentiated approach compared to the Spanish government. Spain is responsible for border security and protection, but the regional authorities of Catalonia are responsible for reception and integration, and allows Catalonia explicitly to identify itself as a refugee-welcoming region. Every year we take part in the Association of Sons and Daughters and Children of Republicans in Exile group, the acronym FREE in Catalan, which hosts events not only to preserve the memory of the retirada, but includes walks across the mountain border, retracing their footsteps, and also invites contemporary refugee support and rescue organisations to contribute to discussions and exhibitions. At the height of the Col de Bellitre at the international border between Portbou and Cerbère, there's a photographic memorial at the Col to the retirada, but opposite, and both in view of each other, is one erected by Franco to his fascist troops, and giving a permanent reminder of the persistence of contested historical memory over 80 years later. On the North French side, celebrated figures like Pablo Picasso and Pablo Casals, both exiles and campaigners for peace, imbue the highest culture, positive attitudes towards refugees. The renowned poet Antonio Machado died within only a few days of his arduous crossing, and he is commemorated annually in Collioure at his grave. In popular culture in the sporting arena, with people like Eric Cantona, descendant of Spanish Civil War refugees himself and born in Marseille, is celebrated and associated with refugee protection, and a stadium at Argel is named in the family's honour. Meanwhile, overlaying all this refugee history, contemporary border narratives are playing out. The EU's Schengen Treaty ended the need for concrete border crossing checkpoints, but the old infrastructure remains, vandalised and empty, but assuming its own more organic art form of memory transformation. And indeed, it was put into use during the COVID confinement when the border was reinstated. Further on the mountain chain of Lampedusa, or else Limites in Catalan, ancient traces of the Roman border between Gaul and Iberia, where the Domitian Way and the Augustinian Way meet, can not only still be seen, but are still used as a route for today's migrants crossing clandestinely into France, many having already made the long and dangerous journey across the Sahara and the Montpellier crossing. Vestiges of the Treaty of the Pyrenees of 1659, marking the end of that particular Franco-Spanish War, can also still be seen as a crudely painted blue line midway down the pavement on the southern side, the Spanish side of the road, and half the pavement being French territory, the shops and the hinterland behind being Spanish, a modern relic in a very prosaic way of a historical treaty. And you can see that little blue dot by my very big red arrow is the international border. So in 2015, after terrorist attacks in France, the emergency provisions of Schengen were invoked by the French government, restoring controls, albeit random, at and beyond the frontier crossing. Long-used local back roads, including the Col de Bagnols, which Benjamin himself passed by, were blocked with boulders to prevent traffic, ostensibly drugs transportation and contraband, but also having the effect of funneling more and more people through the La Jonquera frontier town and a highly intensified security regime there, which in turn is now forcing more and more irregular migrants to walk across rather than risk being caught using vehicle transport through that pass. This has also led to an increasing number of border crossing fatalities, including 3 people killed attempting to go through the train tunnel between Port-Bou and Cerbère. Others have been killed walking on back roads, trying to avoid roadblocks, and some injured and killed on the A9 auto route. Look at the most recent figures by the police themselves in Perpignan. It's hard to get hold of definite numbers, is that 4,000 people a week are being stopped and summarily returned to Spain using bilateral arrangements and the Schengen emergency provisions. Local groups such as SOS Mediterranean and other solidarity networks like ASTI and CIMAD assist refugees arriving in the area. But as Au Cœur de l'Humanité 66 says, more and more people are sleeping on the street on cardboard. Every day about 50 people arrive in a deplorable state, sometimes barefoot, including many children and some families. But it's local community solidarity networks who try to meet those increasing needs in the absence of adequate reception conditions provided at state and municipal level. Meanwhile, The escalation of activities by gendarmes and douane have become highly visible and more frequent, often leading to long tailbacks on the motorway péage search operations for lorries and cars, and there's generally a heightened sense of local tension. This militarisation of the border has been resisted locally, and the boulders on the Col moved apart. Refugee solidarity groups are regularly invited to speak and fundraise at historical, refugee and other cultural associations. Along this frontier at least, this permanent physical and intangible memorials and cultural markers, we see an indelible trace not just on the geographical but on the political and the cultural landscape, which facilitates a strong collective counter-narrative to meet the ever-increasing anti-migration klaxon. Thank you.
Migration, I mean the aftermath of having to migrate. What are some of the things that you've seen as the reasons for the migration? Like, as if each personalized in situation, as if it's globalization, if it's war, or if it's just wanting to leave the country. So anyone can answer that.
So I will. So I did an ethnography with 14 border crossers to Malta.
Can you speak to the microphone?
I can. Sorry for that. 4 of them, as I said, were dead. They were would-be border crossers. So there were 10 living border crossers. And I was aiming to speak with people who had benefited from the Golden Passport program. And I couldn't find anyone to speak on the record with me about that border crossing experience. So then I turned to open up the frame. And I had 2 border crossers who were benefiting from the intra-EU mobility. 1 border crosser from Colombia, and 1 from India, 1 from Libya, 1 from Syria, and 1 from Eritrea, and 3 from Ethiopia. And the thing that I was really, I think, moved by or struck by, like, despite the circumstances being so different, and despite their crossings being so different, one thing that was a through line for all of their sort of aspirations and desires was just this feeling of like, I want to change my life. I just want to do something different. So I sometimes think that physical mobility is a consequence of the impossibility of social mobility within a given space. And whether that's true or not, but if the belief is true, then I think, like most of us, I think that resonates, you know, like even just like inside. But yeah, that was one thing that I heard to the person was, I just wanted to change my life. I just wanted to take this chance. And then, of course, the risk, the lethality of the borders that were then necessary to cross. Now that's a different story, right? But the desire that I saw as a through line was very much like, I want to change my life.
Any other speaker want to say something?
Yeah, and I mean, I can add to speak to the mic.
Bravo.
Yeah, I knew you would say that. I would say that there are as many reasons as there are people, and seeking a better life, but also, I mean, safety. People are moving for so many reasons. My research has focused mainly on especially people stuck in transit, you could say, in North Africa, where they are basically immobile, can't move forward. and have crossed so many borders before that. And the reasons are very different. I mean, some are fleeing war, persecution, others are fleeing because crops on their lands have failed for several seasons, and some are fleeing domestic violence, some are seeking adventure, and yeah, to get more out of life. So I think there's no one answer or reason for that. For moving, I think everybody is moving all the time, and I don't think we ask the same question to us. We are moving somewhere as we do with, you could say, migrants and people from basically the global south.
Any speaker want to add something before other questions? Yes, please.
I'd ask a different question, if I may, which is why are there so many people who just assume they can get a visa and get on a regular form of transport and not question why other people can't, where those systems, even the regular system applying for a visa, is completely dysfunctional, vastly expensive, and ends up costing as much as some of the, let's say, irregular travel agencies that have proliferated, and why those proliferate. There will obviously be always conflicts and people fleeing from situations that they are a necessity, but I think there's a whole industry there that is supported by a presumption on the part of privileged people who just assume that they can travel and do, and yet we ask the question, what motivates other people, what motivates us?
Just very quickly, I would say that most migrants are said to be from Syria, Afghanistan, Sudan, Eritrea, such countries. And their reasons for migration are many and various, but they are mostly armed conflict, persecution for a reason set out in the Refugee Convention, race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Otherwise, torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, or punishment. Yes.
Thank you.
Want to change my life? Well, maybe.
Not exactly a question, just a short response. They leave because they cannot stay.
Other question, Anna.
I had a question for Laura and Lisa, based on the ways in which you talk about the historical aspect to this, and the ways in which there is echoes from that history. And so it was very powerful, your use of the map from 1812, and your use of the Turner painting, because to an extent those kinds of forced migration for enslavement are actually very much paralleled, even though in people's minds, that is something we got rid of then. So how do you feel those historical examples can help you in your work to talk about the present?
Thanks, Alan. So basically for me it's just a realization that there are always traces of colonialism that we should be taking into consideration, and that we shouldn't pretend that we are post that.
Do you want to say something?
Yes, please. So the one thing that I wanted to say is that the legal categories that we see used to justify and stop certain people's mobility, right? They can be truly linked to those old categorizations. And then something else that, like at the end of research, at the end of writing, I just started to get curious because Malta itself was a crown colony, right? And it went through decolonization, 64, by 74 it was independent and administrating itself. But Malta was a colony that was, it was, in a sense, it was objectified, I can say that, but it was also like a place that was built up and developed for the British, because the SAR zone that Malta currently has in the Mediterranean was the British Mediterranean zone, right? So that's number one. And then so I started going down this little rabbit hole, and I was like, like some of these countries that are exempt from needing a visa to enter Schengen space, why? What is the logic behind this? And what I realized is when I got sort of like into that, countries who had gained independence, right, had decolonized and gained independence, they're on the blacklist. But the countries from the British Empire that remained linked with the UK, they're on the whitelist, they're exempt. They're, yeah, also that, but not all. And I think they are mainly compliant, right? But then, well, that's a whole other, I'll stop there. But yeah, so I think that basically we've gone from overt categories that that racialize and differentiate, and also upon like the basis of religion or whatever. And then now we've got these legal categories that mask that, right? But it's super clear in the Maltese context that you are either a migrant or a foreigner. I am a foreigner in Malta, right? That is like, everyone's like, oh, you're a foreigner. You're either a local, you're a foreigner, or you're a migrant. It's simplified, but I think it's still there.
Well, yeah. I wanted to thank Sid Bolton. I'm from the south of France. I was born in Narbonne. And my comment, I really liked, this sort of layering of history that you offered to us. But my comment would be that, being from that area, and I don't know how to put it. I think that the history and the official memorialization, say, could be opposed to something very different, which is that we always knew about this concentration camp. We always knew about Benjamin's death and by suicide, because a lot of people just took that path, So, yeah, really the comment is about official memorization, official history, as opposed to how we, among relatives, among our families, I had my godfather, for instance, was a communist and helped bring arms from, Spain into, and this is a singular history, which I'm sure, because I didn't really talk to him much, but I mean, within his communist friends, most probably a lot of the others did exactly the same thing. Most of my village were refugees from the Franco regime. So in other words, the short question would be, let us think also about the ways in which the state can allow at a certain moment in time for official history, as opposed to the way in which we personally, with our families, in terms of lifetime. My father died not so long ago. He was taken to Germany on forced labor, for instance, and he is the cousin of the communist that I've talked to you about. And we all knew about the concentration camp, but it took all this time for officials, if you want, to do what you showed us. Thank you, Sid.
Do you have some? Yeah, please.
Thank you. And what I said, I certainly wouldn't wish to kind of knowledge that people who have lived for generations with that knowledge bring to the experience and politics of the region. I would say, though, with those memorials that are now official, they were fought for by families. And so that, yes, official has acquiesced to a degree, but these really are local communities who fought every bit for that knowledge to be so conspicuous on the landscape, shall we say. So I think it's a mixture of both, and some of the things that I perhaps could have expressed better. The free organisation is the long history of exile and those families who keep those memories and are moving to walk with them down the col de Banyuls every year, in ever-dwindling numbers, I must say. But it's one of the things I wanted to talk about also was really not so much how those memorials got there, so much as when you're a refugee now and you're walking on those same routes, you're presented with a really positive, it's acknowledging refugees rather than making them invisible, let's put it that way. So you're on that same route, but.
I was just going to say that there is in Catalan at the top col where Sitcho photographs of, there is in Catalan verse from gendarmes from the bell tolls, which no red it's in Catalan, yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, Madrigal, we have a student.
Hello. I was wondering if you could. Okay, so this question is specifically for Dr. Ahlan, but also to the other panelists as well. I was really interested in your research and was hoping that you could speak more to these local communities in Zarzis and their motivation behind engaging with migrant deaths and honoring migrant deaths. I feel like these mass migrant deaths it's so traumatic and so tragic and seems to me so overwhelming. And so I was just hoping you could speak more to what those artists' motivation was behind creating these memorials and really like personally engaging with these deaths of these undocumented peoples as opposed to maybe just trying to avoid it.
Thank you for the question. I think, well, I mean, I won't speculate in the artist's motives because they are obviously, I mean, they're their own. But from my conversations with them and talks with them, obviously it has both of them. I mean, there's Shamsuddin Marzouk, who's not an artist, who is a former, also a fisherman, and basically also a taxi driver and all kinds of things he's done before. Saw, and this was back in 2015, I mean the so-called migration crisis, how bodies were, coming in on the coast of Zarzis, and that there were no one, you could say, responsibility to take care. So it was very much him and a small group of people who wanted to do something about that, and that was how the first one, Cimetière des Inconnus, came into play, which was, as mentioned, in a former landfill. So it wasn't really, an area that was suitable for a burial. And as some of the pictures were showing, it hasn't been maintained properly, and over the years, and basically also just, the conditions just worsened. So as a response to that, the other artist, which is, he's not Tunisian, he's Algerian, but married to a Tunisian, and has a Tunisian, children,
saw that back in, I think it was 2019, 2020, and as a reaction to kind of the undignified manner, wanted to create a dignified cemetery, which was the result of Jardin d'Afrique. And what's interesting to this is, of course, how there were so many, you could say during my field work and talking to these actors, and as well the third one, which was Mohsin, who has the Sea Memory Museum, where he has been collecting all kinds of stuff. And it started as a kind of environmental project for him, where he was just collecting bottles and plastic and everything that kind of washed ashore, and then suddenly it also became like bones or whatever, you know, in parallel to the worsening crisis in the Mediterranean. Bodies was also suddenly part of that, of the objects that he was collecting. The interesting part is that none of the three gentlemen agree with each other in their process, in their approach, in their way of dignifying or visualizing the death. And this is basically, I've been thinking about it a lot, and also talking to activists and talking to locals. All of the three men basically are very polarizing actors, so either you like them or you don't. So that was also interesting to see how, you know, the governing of the death, you know, the politics of the death, who gets to tell the story of the death, and the dignity of the death was interesting to kind of observe from the outside, yeah, especially being in between these three actors. And then, I mean, the situation now, as I mentioned, is that both cemeteries are closed off. The cemetery Saint-Denis was fenced out. Wants me to stop. Yeah, no, we just finished yesterday. It's complicated, basically. I'm going on a short story.
So there are three questions. I don't know if we have time for the three questions because we want to grab a quick coffee before the film. But Ali, please.
Okay. I'll give you another chance to speak alone because my question is for you too. I was thinking of these ripple effects of how they're addressing and touching on different aspects that are not just migration related, right? It's the environmental aspect and then the sort of changing of urban space. And I'm wondering if that generates like different coalitions and intersectional approaches that broaden the debate around migration, that and people see themselves as implicated in it in different ways, or because it can do both, also generate different kinds of backlash. Like the debates in the U.S.-Mexico border, you know, about like migrants leaving trash and damaging the environment in that way, and at the same time that leading to memorialization projects and thinking more broadly about the landscapes and the environments that are part of the processes of migration. So I'm thinking, you know, how the connections between environmental justice movements and migration that are, you know, developing more and more now. How do you see that playing out here and maybe others around gentrification, urban space, displacement within cities, and how that is being like response from activists or artists in linking those issues and creating a much broader debate that isn't just about migration.
Don't answer. I want to take the all questions. I want to take the questions.
Yes, sorry, it's also for you. It's another kind of ripple effect. I was wondering, the island of Java is nearby. So, yeah, I'm curious to know how it works, this relationship.
Don't answer yet. Just say it. Last call. I'm closing the bar. You can answer.
I'll take your answer. I'll be short.
Very short.
Okay. No, I think, I mean, okay, I would love to talk to you about it afterwards. But I think in short, I think it's very interesting to connect these fields. I mean, environmental justice and borders and migration, and I don't think it's been done so much. I mean, when I was looking at this, I was
has been something with the fishermen in Senegal and some new work in also in Italy, like the reverse kind of dynamic from Tunisia, to look at how this also affects not just the borders and the people, but it also has these environmental impacts that we are not, in a sense, giving the same weight in a way, but also because how, again, the slow violence, I think, is a great way to understand these impacts. And I think from the U.S.-Mexico border, with how also the landscape is changing and is really interesting to think with. And we can talk about that. I was at a colloquial called Sahara Sonora, which was connecting these dynamics from Africa to South America.
Jerba.
It was, Jerba is very different from Zarzis, even though they're really close. Jerba is touristic, and you can fly directly from France there on vacation. But actually, many of the bodies that are found on Jerba Island or around it, on the beaches there. So there is obviously a connection, but the cemeteries are in Zarzis, so there's also this transport and logistics aspect of it, which was problematic because transporting bodies that are often decomposed and in often just regular cars or trucks, because there is not a kind of forensic team available. This is often in garages or in spots. So there was this issue, and that was one of the reasons why they wanted to have a kind of small forensic or morgue where they could do some of these things, like having a refrigerator and stuff like that. So
can you be short?
Yeah. So it was complicated to continue. Yeah.